Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. We're going to do Delusional Part 8 today, of course. The essay on Deleuze's thoughts about Hegel from the book called Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage. So this will be interesting because I've heard a little bit about Hegel, but he's notoriously difficult to understand. So I'm interested to see what Deleuze thinks about him too. So, and of course, we're here with Chief Keefe, aka Tim Keefe, and he's got his good philosopher avatar there. So, do you want to start off with a bit of an introduction there, like you usually do, Tim?
Hegel is the most difficult philosopher. The best understatement I've heard in the past several weeks.
Awesome.
Yes. Okay, introduction. Well, let's do a little bit of recap. So we're at part 8 now. And let's see. We have covered so far, it's been a while since we did the last one. But so far in the volume, Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage, we have done Plato, John Duns Scotus, Leibniz, Hume, Kant, Solomon Maimon. And now we're at Hegel. Dun, dun, dun. And I don't think we're going to do it justice because Hegel is quite broad and yes, he is quite difficult. However, I'm going to try to do what I can. All right. So we said at the very beginning of the series is that what Deleuze is doing, well, first of all, what the book is doing is focusing on where Deleuze's influences were. Now, starting in the late 50s, Deleuze had authored a series of monographs going up until, I'd say, about the 90s or so, early 90s. And these were on figures that had influenced him. They were the allies or they were the enemies.
Right.
And the difference here is that of all the essays that are in this philosophical lineage book, Deleuze does not write a monograph on each one of them. Rather, again, these are the influences on his thought throughout his philosophical career.
Right.
But they certainly were strong influences. So the very first essay we looked at was on Platonism, which was a project that Deleuze was trying to do, as were other philosophers since about the time of Plato, which is an overturning of Platonism. And in broad definition, Platonism is the assertion that abstract objects exist. There is this other world that's apart from the physical world, the immediate world. Transcendence versus immanence,
Yeah.
and so on.
Deleuze's plane of immanence is a huge part of his philosophy, right?
Yes. Now he does acknowledge transcendence, but not transcendence in the matter that Plato does, such
Right.
as there's this abstract realm, the forms, the abstract objects from the immediate objects that we see in the everyday world. So that's the chief enemy. But there were other enemies as we're moving forward in the essays. Before we did Maimon, we did Kant, who is part of the enemy, particularly for representation. Now, I also call attention to Kant because Hegel had some serious problems with Kant as well. Kant was important in the history of philosophy because of, among other things, a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism. In particular, that Kant had asserted or acknowledged is that, yes, we do have knowledge that we take in through our senses, but it is not in the strict Humean sense where the mind is just a passive vessel for impressions. Rather, that there is things going on within the mind, going on within reason, and this is reason with a capital R, that gives form to the content of perceptions. And this is where the transcendental deduction comes in. So transcendental meaning not in an otherworldly realm, but something that exists above and beyond what is actually going on.
Right.
Okay?
I had trouble understanding that distinction at first, I remember.
Yeah, it's not evident when you first look at it. So using the term transcendental in that sense, it does make sense because if you're talking about perception, and again, this is one of many things, just the flux of perception that you're drawing within your senses, how do you make sense of it? How do you, if you're looking at, say, the apple that's on the table, you're seeing it, possibly hearing it if you drop it, touching it, tasting it. But how do all these senses coalesce together? How do we do this? Not to mention the fact is, how do we describe the object that we're perceiving as an apple? Well, this is where the transcendental operations come in for what reason is. Concepts, well, first intuitions, which is the sense impression, and then concepts applying to that, and so on.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay? So, moving right along, let's go ahead and jump into Hegel. So, as I said, Hegel had a problem with Kant as well. And let's see. Let me go ahead to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy here because I'm going to need it as I'm trying to go through Hegel. Okay. So.
I was just watching a Slavoj Zizek lecture today, and he calls himself a Hegelian, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He's a very interesting person.
Yes. In the past few years, he wrote a mammoth book called The Fragile Absolute, I believe it is, an update of Hegel for the 21st century, more or less.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay. So here's a section that we can focus on. This is idealism as understood in the German tradition. Okay, so this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is going to give us some background as we're going into Hegel. Okay, so here we go. Beginning. Idealism is a term that had been used sporadically by Leibniz and his followers to refer to a type of philosophy that was opposed to materialism. That is, all that exists is just material objects in the material world. Thus, for example, Leibniz had contrasted Plato as an idealist with Epicurus as a materialist. The opposition to materialism here, together with the fact that in the English-speaking world, Irish philosopher and clergyman George Berkeley is often taken as a prototypical idealist, has given rise to the assumption that idealism is necessarily an immaterialist doctrine. That is, we're not talking about the materialist world. This assumption, however, is mistaken. With the possible exception of Leibniz, the idealism of the Germans was not committed to the type of doctrine found in Berkeley, according to which immaterial minds, both infinite, gods, and finite, those of humans, were the ultimately real entities, with apparently material things to be understood as reducible to states of such minds. That is, to ideas in the sense meant by the British empiricists. Okay. So we touched on, I think, Berkeley at some point in the past, where the chief phrase in Berkeley is to be perceived.
Right. Yeah, that's a famous phrase.
So it is not, again, not an expert on Berkeley, but it is what exists in the world in reality does not exist in and of itself. Instead, it exists by a perception. Tied in with this is, if a forest falls in the trees and there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Right.
Okay, the Berkeleyan would say no, it doesn't, because the perception is involved in making that reality. So, as the encyclopedia entry says here, immaterial minds, God's infinite mind and finite those of humans, these are immaterial things. They are not material things. Yet even today, we still have this difficulty. Instead of because we're not talking, at the time, they were not talking so much about consciousness, but consciousness is still one of those things that nobody knows what the hell it is.
Yeah.
They might try to reduce it to physical brain states, in which case it is material. Some philosophers do. Others don't even try that. They say it's still immaterial, and we don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. So back in this time, in Berkeley's time, they are immaterial. God has a mind which is infinite, and then us human beings, we have a finite mind. These are the only real entities. And material things are apparently there, but they are reducible to such states in the minds.
Okay.
Okay. So that is the British empirical idealist tradition. Now continuing. As Leibniz's use of Plato to exemplify idealism suggests, idealists in the German tradition tended to hold to the reality or objectivity of ideas in the Platonic sense. And for Plato, it would seem, such ideas were not conceived as in any mind at all. not even the mind of Plato's God. The type of picture found in Berkeley was only to be found in certain late antique Platonists, and especially early Christian Platonists, like St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. But especially for the German idealists like Hegel, Plato's philosophy was understood through the lenses of more Aristotelian varieties of Neoplatonism, which pictured the thoughts of a divine mind as immanent in matter and not as contained in some purely immaterial or spiritual mind. It thus had features closer to the more pantheistic picture of divine thought found in Spinoza, for example, for whom matter and mind were attributes of the one substance. So note here, Spinoza definitely influenced Hegel with the pantheistic picture.
Right.
And the note here in this paragraph is that, so the German idealists, yes, that ideas exist more in the Platonic sense, but not in any mind. Okay? So now we're going back to Plato.
I like that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So we remember we were going through Deleuze with ideas, that idea with a capital I. So an idea is one of the forms. That is the idea. You have the chair, you have the idea of the chair. You have the apple, you have the idea of the apple. So these exist in the otherworldly realm. But, continuing, is that Plato's philosophy was understood through the lenses of a more Aristotelian varieties of Neoplatonism, which pictured the thoughts of a divine mind as immanent in matter, and not as contained in some purely immaterial or spiritual mind. So this is where Spinoza comes in. God is not another worldly being. The Spinoza's God is not another worldly being, but exists, but nature is God. So if there is a mind, or if there's ideas, they already exist within nature, within matter, but they are immanent within the matter, and they are not necessarily transcended as separate from matter.
So that's the pantheism?
That's pantheism, yes.
Right.
So what's going on here is a return to Plato, but it's an admixture with Spinoza.
Okay.
Okay.
And to go back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the British idealists, you were talking about how they're associated with empiricism. So the British empiricists in particular are more associated, the British idealists rather are more associated with that than the rationalists.
Yes, because of empiricism.
Okay.
Okay.
That's interesting to me because I would think that rationalists would be more interested in empiricism than idealists, like just intuitively without knowing that much about it.
Well, you recall when we were looking at Maimon, is that Maimon was critical of Hume. He then went back to Leibniz. So now, as I said in the very beginning, it's not that the rationalists completely did away with empiricism, perception. Of course they didn't, because, duh, we perceive. But they didn't place the kind of emphasis upon empiricism that the British empiricists did.
Okay.
Okay. So then, again, the thing with the British idealists is that, particularly around Berkeley's time, is that perception is much more important than it's going to be in the German idealist tradition.
Okay.
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 Okay. The thing about the rationalists and then going into the German idealists is that, yeah, perception is there, but it's not everything. In fact, it's lesser than rationalism, ideas, pantheistic picture of Spinoza, all those things.
Okay.
Okay. It's not the be all, it's not the be all and the end all. There is something far more than just ordinary perception.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so continuing, even for Leibniz, whose later monadological metaphysics was perhaps closer to Berkeley's immaterialist philosophy, an opposition to materialism didn't necessarily imply immaterialism. Okay, let me read that again. An opposition to materialism didn't necessarily imply materialism.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's because even I myself probably have automatically assumed that before.
Right. Yeah. Right. So Leibniz had resisted Descartes' postulation of distinct spiritual and material substances. In this case would be God and would be the cogito and the res extensa, treating corporeal bodies as inseparable combinations of form and matter after the manner of Aristotle. This is the hylomorphic distinction here. The materialists to which he was opposed, mechanistic corpuscularists of his time. Corpuscularis refers to a corpuscle, which is a small individual piece of matter. Not quite an atom, but somewhere in the same ballpark.
Okay.
Okay. Mechanistic corpuscularists of his time conceived of unformed matter as a type of self-subsistent substance, and it seems to have been that conception to which he was opposed, at least in some periods of his work. Not the reality of matter per se. Leibniz's combination of Platonic and Aristotelian notions played a role in the thought of the later idealists, giving their opposition to materialism its distinctive character. These anti-immaterialist features of the idealism of the Germans became more prominent in the post-Kantian period as they moved progressively away from the more subjectivistic features of Leibniz's thought.
That's
Okay?
interesting.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound that different from materialism to me. And it sounds like, I mean, what exactly happened in terms of that in the late as they progress further in time, as you just mentioned?
Well, the thing about materialism is that even today is that some philosophers and scientists will say there is nothing more than matter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In particular, when we're talking about the brain or about consciousness,
Yeah.
whatever it is, consciousness can be to reduce the brain states.
Yeah.
And
The eliminative materialists.
right, eliminative materialists. Good.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the term. So anything that we can say about the mind, anything we can say about consciousness or what have you, can be reduced to a brain state. Okay. That's a materialist perspective because
Right.
the brain is something material. The brain is a physical organ. Now, what consciousness is, what the mind is, okay, that could be reduced to a brain state. We're not even getting into the labyrinthine explanations of what the mind is, what consciousness is, because there's many, many different definitions of what those two things are.
Right.
Okay. But the key point here we want to draw upon is that just because one is opposed to materialism doesn't imply that one is an immaterialist.
It kind of reminds me about how when we've been talking about so-called postmodernists in our two different series on that now, that that people being opposed to meta narratives and being opposed to moral absolutes and that sort of thing does not make them relativists.
Right. Right. Yeah, this is something where it's one of those where I say you have to sit on it and think about it, because you think that if not A, then B. No,
Yes.
not that case.
Mm-hmm.
It could be C, could be D, could be Z, could be something else.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Could be a
So,
letter we've never heard of.
right. Okay. So that is the background of what idealism is understood in the German idealistic tradition. This stems from Leibniz. Okay. Now, the next section is the traditional metaphysical view of Hegel's philosophy. Okay. So we got some here. Given the understanding of Hegel that predominated at the time of the birth of analytic philosophy, which is the early 20th century, together with the fact that early analytic philosophers were rebelling precisely against Hegelianism so understood, the interpretation of Hegel encountered in discussions within analytic philosophy is often that of the late 19th century interpretation. Now, just a point, Hegel died in the early 19th century. I think it was 1810, I want to say, 1811, very early 19th century.
Okay.
In this picture, Hegel is seen as offering a metaphysical religious view of God, qua absolute spirit, as the ultimate reality that we can come to know through pure thought processes alone. Okay, let me say that again. Hegel is seen as offering a metaphysical religious view of God qua absolute spirit, as the ultimate reality that we can come to know through pure thought processes alone. In short, Hegel's philosophy is treated as exemplifying the type of pre-critical or dogmatic metaphysics against which Kant had reacted in his Critique of Pure Reason, and as a return to a more religiously driven conception of philosophy to which Kant had been opposed.
Hmm.
Okay?
So that's interesting. So it's like it seems like it's a little sort of ambiguous in terms of what exactly Hegel meant by metaphysics. And it's interesting, this idea that you can sort of come to know God intuitively just through your thoughts. That's interesting.
Yeah, that goes back to Anselm with the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. That God is that being through which nothing can greater be thought. Therefore, God
Mhm.
exists. That's an
It's kind of
oversimplification, but
it's kind of that the problem with that, obviously, many people have pointed this out before, is that that means that anything could conceivably be God.
well, fortunately, Spinoza came around a few centuries later and say nature was God.
Right. Right.
We've covered all our bases then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, dogmatic metaphysics to which Kant was reacting against in the Critique of Pure Reason, because one of the questions that he was asking in the Critique of Pure Reason is, how is metaphysics as a science possible? Because if you make statements about metaphysics that have no backing, particularly empirically or analytically, or sorry, synthetic, the synthetic a priori and all that, then it doesn't wash dogmatic metaphysics.
Right.
If you say God exists, okay, prove it. And then we go through all the proofs about God is the ontological or the teleological or whatever they're the cosmological arguments, whatever it is, and you subject each one of those to a critique and they fall short.
Right.
Okay. And then as we covered when we looked over Kant, is that God is one of the ideas that exists beyond reason, where reason itself cannot prove or nor disprove that God exists, among other things, such as the soul
Right.
and everything else.
And this is part of that idealism.
Yes. Well, this is again, as the article mentions, this is the traditional view of Hegel.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So Kant was in the critical philosophy. Then, when we come to Hegel, Hegel busts out of what Kant had said, and instead is taking it as a metaphysical theological view, because Hegel was also religious. Undergirding the religious approach that Hegel has was a Trinitarian Protestant view. Trinitarian meaning the Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. So continuing, there is much that can be found in Hegel's writings that seems to support this view. In his lectures during his Berlin period, one comes across claims such as the one that philosophy, quote, has no other object but God, and so is essentially rational theology. Indeed, Hegel often seems to invoke imagery consistent with the types of Neoplatonic conceptions of the universe that have been common within Christian mysticism, especially in the German states in the early modern period. The peculiarity of Hegel's form of idealism, on this account, lies in his idea that the mind of God becomes actual only via its particularization in the minds of his finite material creatures. Thus, in our consciousness of God, we somehow serve to realize his own self-consciousness and thereby his own perfection.
Hmm. So this is all still like conclusions that you reach yourself in your own mind.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. In English language interpretations, such a picture is effectively found in the work of Charles Taylor and Michael Rosen, for example. With its dark mystical roots and its overtly religious content, it is hardly surprising that the philosophy of Hegel, so understood, has rarely been regarded as a live option within the largely secular and scientific conceptions of philosophy that have been dominant in the 20th century. Okay, so going back to an earlier point, part of what helped the emergence of analytic philosophy and sent it down this path was a reaction against Hegelianism.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because with the traditional metaphysical view, that was received in Hegel, particularly in the English-speaking world. And in particular, we're talking about Russell and Moore, two of the fathers of analytic philosophy, the Cambridgeites. They're just like, this doesn't wash anymore. So we're going to set to do something that is more, shall we say, immanent, something that is less metaphysical, certainly, and something that is less religious.
Okay.
Okay. So then, as throughout the 20th century, as analytic philosophy unfolded, Hegel kind of fell by the wayside. Nobody was really looking at him seriously anymore.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So when did they start looking at him again?
Well, he never went completely away. I think that Hegel scholarship began a resurgence somewhere in the 70s, 80s, because there's some important books that came out at the time.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right, continuing. An important consequence of Hegel's metaphysics, so understood, concerns history and the idea of historical development or progress. And it is as an advocate of an idea concerning the logically necessitated teleological course of history that Hegel is most often derided. To critics such as Karl Popper in his popular post-war The Open Society and Its Enemies, Hegel not only advocated a disastrous political conception of the state and the relation of its citizens to it, a conception prefiguring 20th century totalitarianism, but he had also tried to underpin such advocacy with dubious theological metaphysical speculations. With his idea of the development of spirit in history, Hegel is seen as literalizing a way of talking about different cultures in terms of their spirits, of constructing a developmental sequence of epochs typical of 19th century ideas of linear historical progress, and then enveloping the story of human progress in terms of one about the developing self-conscious of the cosmos God itself. So in other words, Hegel places a lot of stress on history in his philosophy. And there is historical development, there is progress. If you look at the lectures on the history of philosophy, starting with the Greeks, even somewhat beforehand, or the philosophy of history, we are going from inferior, at least inferior the way they saw it, to something that is superior, possibly. Some kind of an evolution is taking place. But the world spirit, the absolute spirit, cosmos God, is progressing through history, and it is guiding the development of history as it's going through.
Okay.
Okay.
This is sort of the Hegel was a huge influence on Marx, right? And
Yes.
is that part of his influence there, especially what you mentioned earlier about political issues in particular?
Oh, sure. But the thing with Marx is, as he himself described it, he was going to stand Hegel on his head. So, with the development of history, because about the classical Marxist approach is that as we're progressing, the revolution of the proletariat, capitalism is overthrown, and then we are going into a socialist society.
Right.
Okay, this is a progression, starting from all the way back in primitive accumulation, feudalism, blah blah blah. Okay, so this is a progression. The difference here is that we're not talking about a cosmos God. We're talking about materialism, dialectical materialism, as progressing through.
Yeah.
Okay.
Marx wasn't religious, right?
No, he was born a Jew, but he was a non-believing Jew.
Right.
Okay, actually a Jew who converted to Protestantism, as did his family.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
because Jews were, you know, um, not very well treated in Germany at the time. That's why they converted.
Okay.
Okay, so history, cosmos God, progression, human progress, the development of events, which culminates, in the philosophy of right, a separate work, is the culmination of the state. Okay, and this is what Popper was against. Everybody subjects themselves to the power of the state.
Right.
Okay. Continuing, as the bottom line of such an account concerned the evolution of states of a mind, which is God's, such an account is clearly an idealist one, but not in the sense, say, of Berkeley. The pantheistic legacy inherited by Hegel meant that he had no problem in considering an objective outer world beyond any particular subjective mind. Let me say that again. The pantheistic legacy inherited by Hegel meant that he had no problem in considering an objective outer world beyond any particular subjective mind. But this objective world itself had to be understood as conceptually informed. It was objectified spirit. Thus, in contrast to Berkeleyan subjective idealism, it became common to talk of Hegel as incorporating the objective idealism of views, especially common among German historians, in which social life and thought were understood in terms of the conceptual or spiritual structures that informed them. But in contrast to both forms of idealism, Hegel, according to this reading, postulated a form of absolute idealism by including both subjective life and the objective cultural practices on which subjective life depended upon the dynamics of the development of the self-consciousness and self-actualization of God, the absolute spirit.
Okay, so it's sort of the idea that if you take into account this progression of history, then that can be what we can use to form an objective view of the spirit.
Sort of. So the key terms here, yes, he had no problem considering an objective outer world beyond a particular subjective mind. So my mind, your mind, the minds of everybody, of all human beings, and possibly animals, subjective minds. This is not Berkeleyan subjective idealism. Okay, remember what we said before about Berkeley?
Yeah.
Okay, that's subjective idealism. So objective idealism of views. So if we're talking about the world's, the absolute spirit, God, you could even say, objectively exists. But there's an absolute idealism. That's the key term here. So we as subjects, we have our own subjective lives. And then there are all the cultural practices, which are objective, incorporated in toto in everything for the development of self-consciousness and self-actualization of God.
So does that mean that it's both subjective and objective, or only objective, but it's like composed of subjective parts?
Well, there are subjects.
Yeah.
Then there are then it's objective. That's where absolute idealism comes in.
Okay.
Okay. Because if we're talking specifically about just subjective, then we go back to Berkeley. To be is to be perceived.
Right.
Okay. It is subjective to me in my mind, also subjective in God's mind. Subjects are involved. If it's objective, the subject doesn't matter. You know, when the common sense view of reality, it exists objectively from our perceptions of it.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's another way to look at it. However, you could even say as the absolute here, idealism is that me as a subject, there is the object of reality. It is all of a piece of something that is much greater.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So this
This is where the shades of a religious view come in,
right.
because the common sense way that somebody would talk about that is, there is such a thing as God. However, they would say God exists apart from reality. God created the world, the cosmos, blah, 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 and exists apart from that.
Right.
Not in this case, because the Spinozist influence is that God is within here. So you and I are creatures of God, but we are creatures existing within God.
Right.
And everything is unfolding according to a certain kind of progression.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the pantheistic view.
Right. All right. And continuing, despite this seemingly dominant theological theme, Hegel was still seen by many as an important precursor of other more characteristically secular strands of modern thought, such as existentialism and Marxist materialism. Existentialists were thought of as taking the idea of the finitude and historical and cultural dependence of individual subjects from Hegel, and as leaving out all pretensions to the absolute. While Marxists were thought of as taking the historical dynamics of the Hegelian picture, but reinterpreting this in materialist rather than idealist categories. As for understanding Hegel himself, the traditional metaphysical view remained the dominant interpretive approach of Hegel scholars throughout much of the 20th century. In the last quarter of the century, however, it came to be vigorously questioned, with a variety of interpreters putting forth very different accounts of the basic structure of Hegel's philosophical project. While a number of interpretations of Hegel have emerged during this period in an effort to acquit him of implausible metaphysical theological views, one prominent tendency has been to stress the continuity of his ideas with the, quote, critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Okay.
Oh, okay. That's interesting that that clash between Hegel and Kant. And I obviously knew about Hegel's influence on Marx, but I didn't know about that influence on existentialism. That's interesting.
Yeah, particularly for Sartre. When Sartre talks about the in itself and the for itself,
Right.
he took that from Hegel.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Different terms.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. What else can we cover here, if anything? Let's see. Okay, so we won't go into the post-Kantian reading or the revised reading of Hegel because they're not important to our project here with Deleuze.
Okay.
Let's see. Do we want to cover the logic? Sure, let's go ahead and do that. Okay. So we're going to skip the section on the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's most important book. And instead, we're going to take a quick look at the science of logic, itself also important, but not as read or not as cited as much as the phenomenology of spirit. Okay.
Okay.
So Hegel's science of logic is divided into 3 books, dealing with the topics of being, essence, and the concept, which appeared in 18, 12, 13, and 16, respectively. These are what the three books each treat. For most of the 20th century, it was not received with the enthusiasm that often marked the reception of phenomenology of spirit. First, as a work of logic, most have regarded it as radically outdated and relying on an Aristotelian approach that was definitely surpassed in the later 19th century, a view promoted especially by Bertrand Russell in the early years of the 20th. So the thing about the 19th and the 20th centuries is that there was an explosion in different kinds of thinking about logic, leaving Aristotelian type logic behind.
Yeah.
Thus, many readers sympathetic to particular doctrines in Hegel have attempted, contrary to Hegel's insistence, to quarantine his philosophical approach to particular areas from it. Recently, the skepticism has started to change. Some advocate that the science of logic be read as a first-order ontological doctrine, or as a category theory that simultaneously represents structures of being and thought, and so is having very little to do with what has traditionally been known as logic. Others argue that in contrast to the project of formal or general logic, it is best understood as a version of what Kant had called transcendental logic. In this sense, it should thereby be thought as a successor to Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories and the Critique of Pure Reason, in which Kant attempted to derive a list of those non-empirical concepts, the categories, which he believed to be presupposed by all empirical judgments made by finite, discursive knowers like ourselves. In short, taking the logic as a category theory opens up 2 general lines of interpretation. Should the categories be understood as primarily ontological categories, as found in Aristotle, or as primarily categories revealing the necessary structure of thought, as in Kant? Those, such as the advocates of the revised metaphysical interpretation, interpreting Hegel as basically a metaphysician, typically stress the former, while post-Kantian interpreters typically stress the latter.
Okay.
Okay? So the logic is not a logic textbook. The logic instead is talking about being, essence, and the concept.
Right.
But, as the paragraph says, are we looking at Hegel as a metaphysician, or are we looking at Hegel as something that's post-Kantian, closer to Kant? There are different interpretations, and we're not going to get into that here. Alrighty. Okay, so let's go to the next paragraph. Reading into the first chapter of Book 1. Being, it is quickly seen that the transitions of the logic broadly repeat those of the first chapters of the Phenomenology. Now, however, is between the categories themselves rather than between conceptions of the respective objects of conscious experience. Thus, being is the thought determination with which the work commences. It, at first, seems to be the most immediate, fundamental determination that characterizes any possible thought content at all. In other words, whenever you think about something, it exists.
Oh, okay.
That's being.
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
In contrast, being in the Phenomenology Sense Certainty chapter was described as the known truth of the purported immediate sensory given. The
Wait,
category that it,
wait. Just go back to that there. Does that mean if I imagine that Scarlett Johansson will appear in front of me, she'll appear in front of me?
no.
If you
Or-
think of something, it exists.
Well,
What
that's
if it's
implied. That right. That's implied in it. Okay.
okay?
Whatever you're thinking about exists.
Okay.
One could even go a little bit further because we start to see this when we're getting into phenomenology, particularly Franz Montano, who I covered in my thesis, by the way, about the inexistence of an object. So if you're thinking of if you're thinking that Scarlett Johansson is your girlfriend, we'll run with this example, even though it does exist in the actual world, it still exists, but it's
Okay.
existing in your consciousness. However,
So
the
okay.
point is that you and Scarlett Johansson and the relationship between you being already undergirds this.
Okay.
Okay,
So we only think about things that exist?
right.
Okay.
Okay, even if the thing does not exist in the actual world.
Right. Like if we're thinking about a unicorn.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
A unicorn being is already implied in it because you're thinking of a unicorn. You've seen a description of a unicorn. You can describe something, you can draw it or whatever it is. Being is always there. It's
That reminds me of the that book on Rorty that we were reading for our series on Rorty on for Hayden's podcast. I
mhm,
remember in one part of that when he's talking about writing and language,
mhm,
there's this idea that this exact same idea, I think, that something exists, even if it's something fictional, it
mhm.
exists in a way.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Otherwise, how would a fictional world exist?
yeah,
You know, but there's always being.
yeah.
So whatever thought is about, that topic must in some sense exist. Like those purported simple sensory givens with which the phenomenology starts. This is the phenomenology of spirit. The category being looks to have no internal structure or constituents. But again, in a parallel to the phenomenology, it is the effort of thought to make this category explicit that both undermines it and brings about new ones.
Okay,
Okay. Being seems to be both immediate and simple, but will show itself to be, in fact, only something in opposition to something else, nothing.
okay.
Okay, let me read that again. Being seems to be both immediate and simple, but it will show itself to be, in fact, only something in opposition to something else, nothing.
Yeah, that
So,
makes sense. The opposite of nothing is being.
right, and the opposite of being is nothing.
Right. Okay.
The point seems to be that while the categories being and nothing seem both absolutely distinct and opposed, on reflection, and following Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, they appear identical as no criterion can be invoked which differentiates them. The only way out of this paradox is to posit a third category within which they can exist as negated, the German is aufgehoben, moments. This category is becoming, which saves thinking from paralysis because it accommodates both concepts. Becoming contains being and nothing in the sense that when something becomes, it passes, as it were, from nothingness to being. But these contents cannot be understood apart from their contributions to the overarching category. This is what it is to be negated, aufgehoben, within the new category.
Oh, I like this idea of becoming. I feel like we might have talked about it before. It sounds like a very delusional idea.
Right. Now, the reason why I'm covering this is because we're going to see this in the essay. We've
Right.
already seen that becoming is very important to Deleuze in the previous essays.
Yeah.
Okay. But to recap here, so being is what undergirds everything. But being is in opposition to nothing. To prevent any kind of a paralysis, because it's just like, well, how can you because we're thinking about why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. Where did so that whole thing about where did the universe come from? Did it already
Hmm.
exist, or did it pop out in the Big Bang, or was it created? Well, the other category between the two is becoming. So ex nihilo nihil fit, which is a Latin phrase such as out of nothing comes nothing. Instead, when something becomes being, it comes out of nothing through becoming.
Interesting.
Okay, and the important phrase about Aufgehoben, we're seeing this in the dialectic. Hegel's
Okay.
dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis.
Okay.
Okay, the thesis, the antithesis is the opposition to the thesis. The antithesis is when both are negated and something new arises. This is when it
Okay.
becomes. Okay,
Right.
all right. In general, this is how the logic proceeds. Seeking its most basic and universal determination, thought posits a category to be reflected upon, finds then that this collapses due to a contradiction generated, like that generated by the category being, and so then seeks a further category with which to make retrospective senses of those contradictory categories. However, in turn, the new category will generate some further contradictory negation, and again, the demand will arise for a further concept that can reconcile these opposed concepts by incorporating them as moments. So here's the dialectic at work.
Okay.
Okay.
That's interesting.
The method Hegel employs here, determinant negation, is often compared with Spinoza's principle that, quote, all determination is negation. But while Hegel's is related to Spinoza's thought, it cannot be identified with or reduced to it. Spinoza's top-down determination starts with a single category, in this case, divine substance, that is then progressively divided by the application of concepts. The model being Plato's method of division, in which a genus concept is divided into particular species by the presence or absence of some differentiating property. From Hegel's point of view, however, this cannot capture individuals as other than parts of that greater whole, a metaphysical picture in relation to Spinoza he refers to as a cosmism.
Okay.
Okay? So Hegel will balance this type of determination by negation, with a different type of negation modeled on that which holds between incompatible properties of some sort. For example, red and blue as incompatible colors. And that is reflected in the term negation of Aristotle's logic. This allows Hegel to go beyond the determination of something as particular, suggesting the part-whole relation, to a more robust sense of singularity, the sense of the pure thisness, as initially seen in the Phenomenology Sense Certainty chapter, the truth of which was then shown to be Aristotle's idea of an individual thing's substantial form in the Perception chapter. It is in terms of this category that we can think, according to Aristotle, along with Aristotle, of a thing having an underlying substrate within which properties inhere, and which, unlike the properties themselves, cannot be thought in general terms, but only in the terms of the category of singularity. And yet this will encounter a problem for the determinacy of this underlying substrate. It will have to find determinate contrasts that allow it to be determinately conceived. In Book
Okay.
2 of the Logic, we will learn that the category of singularity will rely on particularity, just as particularity has been shown to rely on singularity. Singular substrates or essences can only be known in relation to the general properties that constitute their appearances. Okay.
And what's the difference between singularity and particularity again in that context?
Okay. Well, let's go. Let's recap what's talking about here. So, Spinoza has a top-down approach. This is his determination. The divine substance, God. Okay.
Right.
Everything is part of the divine substance. That's what he starts with. And
Right.
then by concepts, we're carving out individual things from this divine substance. Okay?
Okay.
Follow me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Progressively abided by the application of concepts. Okay, genus and the different species. This is taken from Plato. Okay, but the problem Hegel sees with this is, what do we do about the individual? If we're taking the divine substance and we're carving out by concepts little parts of it, then they're just parts of the greater whole. They don't become individuals themselves.
Okay.
Okay? All this is determination. So this type of determination, Hegel bounces by negation. Okay, incompatible properties. A is not B. B is not C. C is not D. They are incompatible.
Okay.
Okay? So then going beyond the determination of something as particular to a more robust sense of singularity. So then proceeding forward, because with Aristotle, he had the concept of the substance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the substance is what undergirds the particular thing. The properties inhere in it. The form is not without the content. The substance is what undergirds this. It all is of a part, and this is the singularity. I guess another way you can think about it is when you're looking at the human being. Okay, taking Andrew for example, eyes, mouth, ears, hair color, personality, quirks, so on. We could run through the list.
Mm-hmm.
We don't take all of those as individual. If we did, we're just carving out little pieces from the part that is Andrew.
Okay.
Andrew, taken as the totality, in one sense, is the singularity. This is
Okay.
Andrew.
Okay.
A whole person, you could even say. That's what a singularity is.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense.
And let's see. Okay, so I'll go to the next paragraph, and then we'll head over to the Deleuze essay. So, continuing, attempting to unravel the intricacies of the patterns of dependence between such categories will be the task of this mammoth work. Yes, and the logic is quite big. But here a general point might be made. If Hegel's thought here is considered to be, like Spinoza's, holistic, it is only so at a higher level of abstraction, such that these determinations of singularity, particularity, and universality cannot themselves be understood in isolation from each other, but only via their complex interactions. Hegel only explicitly explores the details of the interactions of these determinations of conceptuality in his discussion of judgments and syllogisms in Book 3, The Doctrine of Concept, suggesting that concerns of logic as traditionally conceived are not as irrelevant to the science of logic as often thought. However, the general point separating his approach from that of Spinoza clearly emerges earlier on. Determinate negation is not Spinoza's principle, as Spinoza's presupposes a whole that precedes its parts, and that all negations are negations of something that is primitively positive. In contrast, Hegel's negations will be negations of determinations that are already to be conceived as themselves negations.
I'm a little confused by that last part.
Okay, let me see if I can unpack this. So we'll read it again. Determinate negation is not Spinoza's principle. Spinoza presupposes a whole that precedes its parts. This is the divine substance. This is the whole. The divine substance precedes its parts. All negations are negations of something that is primitively positive. So, if we're talking about being and nothingness,
Mm-hmm.
being and nothing rather, being is primary to nothing. That's the determinate negation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, being is the positive, nothing is the negative. Hegel's is the reverse.
Okay.
Okay,
Being is the negative, nothing is the positive.
right. So being is defined in contrast to the nothing.
Okay.
Okay, now we can use that as the segue into the Deleuze essay. And there are already some things that are emerging from this. This is a summary of Hegel. We're not reading Hegel himself. We recall what we were covering before with Deleuze. Is that what is Deleuze operating against? Platonism is one. Anything that is transcendental, really, and not immanent, is another one.
Mm-hmm.
And now what we're going to see in the essay, because it treats the science of logic and about negation. Okay. So, like with identity and difference, identity
Mm-hmm.
was taken to be primary to difference. This is something positive. What does Deleuze do? He flips it around.
Yeah.
Difference is the negative from which being the positive emerges. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure, because I haven't really read the essay that closely, is that this is where he's focusing on in Hegel.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
any questions about this for Hegel? This is a real compacted description of kind of what Hegel's project is. We skipped over the phenomenology, primary state of sense perception. We went straight to the science of logic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything unclear? Anything doesn't make sense?
No, I think you cleared up the parts that I was confused by there.
Okay. All right. With no further questions, we will go to the essay. This is essay number 7, page 130, G.W.F. Hegel by Bruce Bau. Okay. So Bau says on the first page, quote, "Yet Deleuze's rejection of Hegel, and Hegel is the enemy here, by the way, from start to finish, rests on the firm conviction that Hegel's philosophy has betrayed difference by making difference into something negative, negation, opposition, contradiction. And it is against this Hegelian negativity that Deleuze so tirely inveighs." Okay, so we've already seen this here. Has betrayed difference. Remember, difference is very important for Deleuze, by turning it into something negative. So, like being and nothing, being is first, nothing is something else, and they're in opposition with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so continuing. From the beginning, Deleuze sought to construct an ontology and a logic of affirmative difference that would resist the famous Hegelian identity and of difference, which makes difference into a passing moment of being, capital B, contradicting itself via its multiple determinations in the absolute idea.
Okay.
Okay? So, summarizing quickly, is that being, multiple determinations, the absolute idea, goes through these passing moments. This is just on the way. Pay no attention here. Just go by it. So
Okay.
Deleuze is focusing on that and saying, no, I will not accept that from Hegel.
Okay.
Okay? So continuing on. Next page. In his science of logic, Hegel continually finds negations underlying difference. And his dialectic consists in making negations more and more internal. Thus, to begin with, a being is something determinate only to the extent that it differs from, or is not another thing. And not being another is thus a constitutive moment of its own identity, as the negation of the negation. But just as for the first thing, A, the second, B, is the other, so the first A is the other of the second B, and each thing is then both itself and another. And in that respect, they are indistinguishable, and each passes into its other, such that each takes its otherness unto itself and becomes other than self. If the other is then conceived apart from its relation to a determinate something, and thus becomes the other as such, it becomes pure externality, the external relations which obtain in being which is external to itself, nature as space, time, and matter, which is always altering, becoming, and yet remains the same as itself.
Oh, that's
Confused?
interesting.
Confused yet?
I think we might have talked about this before in terms of the aspect of like how when one thing becomes another, it still maintains a part of what it was before.
Right.
So I get that part because I think that I kind of get what is said. It is a little confusing though. It's hard to keep track of. You got to keep focused on all of these tiny details.
Right. So let's take a physical example. Let's look at water. Okay. So water, remembering from Science 101, exists in one of a handful of states: liquid, solid, or gas, vapor. Okay. So I have a glass of water that's on my desk right now, from which I've been drinking. If I heat the water, what happens to it? Slowly, it will start to bubble. It boils. And then what happens to it? It will start to turn into vapor. It will continue to do so unless I cut off the heat, and then it cools down and returns back to its liquid state. But in the process, the water is changing from its liquid state to its vapor state.
So it's in between those two states, kind of.
It's in between those two states, but not to mention the fact is that it's still water, because water vapor is still water. It's just in a
Right.
different state. Conversely, if I reduce the temperature, what happens to the water? It changes from a liquid state to a solid state, what we call ice. And it is in between those states as it is freezing, and it's still water. Okay,
Yeah.
so this thing here. But just as for the first thing A and the second B is the other, so the first is the other of the second. Okay,
Yeah.
so if we're talking about two different balls, a red ball and a blue ball, A is itself, and A is the other of B. Of the red ball is itself and is the other of the blue ball, just as the blue ball is of itself and is the other of the red ball.
Right.
Okay, each thing is then both itself and another, and in that respect they're indistinguishable, and each passes into its other, such as each takes its otherness on into itself and becomes other than self. So then going back to the water example, as it's changing states, water vapor changes into liquid water. So they're passing into one another. The vapor is taking on the quality, as it's happening, of the liquid, and the liquid is taking on the quality of the vapor. It becomes other
Mm-hmm.
than self. If the other is then conceived apart from its relation to a determinate something and becomes the other as such, it becomes pure externality. So the two balls, the red and the blue ball, if I take the red ball and put it in the other room, it becomes another and is not defined in relation to the blue ball. It's a pure externality.
Okay.
Okay? Make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So Bao continues, this natural progression is taken up at a higher level in the form of principles of thought or logic. The law of identity, which is A equals A, can also be expressed negatively. A is not equal to not A, so that A affirms itself by distinguishing itself from not A, or by negating its negation. But in negating its negation, not A, it has nothing from which to distinguish itself, and so becomes self-related negativity. That is no longer difference from another, but absolute difference.
Okay.
Okay?
So compare, like you have to compare something to itself to see the difference in order to define it as a separate thing in itself.
Well, here's one way to look at it. So let's talk about the balls again. Red ball, blue ball. So the red ball is distinguished from the blue ball, and vice versa. Okay, that's a different from another. But if we're talking something different to illustrate this, as a person, as when you say, I'm not the same person I used to be,
Yeah.
what is the relation here? Okay, we're still talking about the same person, at least conceptually we are. So this would be absolute difference. Okay, You, Andrew, is the 30-something versus Andrew is the 10-year-old. That's
Right.
an absolute difference. We're still talking about the same person, but you are not defining against something else or somebody else. Your mom, your relatives, me, friends, or whatever it is.
Okay.
Okay?
You
So,
so people change, and that's how you can like define yourself based on like how you have changed, right?
yes, and you're
Okay.
becoming.
Yeah.
You're becoming another person as you're growing older.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? So continuing, absolute difference is difference identical with itself, or self-related difference, and thus contains both difference and identity in relation to itself. Let me read it again. And thus contains both difference and identity in its relation to itself. But as difference and identity negate each other, absolute difference falls apart into diversity, in which two terms are identical to themselves, but different from each other. This difference is then external to the two terms, and the two terms are indifferent to one another. But an external difference, the difference vanishes inasmuch as each term, being equally like itself, is the same as the other, and cannot confirm its difference. Rather, external difference relies on a comparison made by a third party, which assesses the similarity or dissimilarity of the two terms with respect to a common element that connects them as being more or less similar or dissimilar to each other. It is only when this common mediating element is internalized that difference becomes opposition between two sides opposed to each other as positive and negative, without reference to a third term. In opposition, the different is not confronted to any other, capital O, but by its other, capital O.
So I'm pretty sure I'm just really confused about this, but is he sort of saying that you need some sort of like third or even like some internal transcendental perspective to be able to distinguish two things from each other than by identifying them based on difference and becoming?
I think that's close. So
Okay.
the key here is external difference. Okay, that's the key term. External difference relies on a comparison made by a third party, which assesses the similarity or dissimilarity of the two terms with respect. I can say that the red ball is different from the blue ball by virtue of color. There might be something else. The red ball is a little older than the blue ball. It's been thrown against the wall many times, whereas the blue ball is fresh out of its package. So there's a little bit of worn there. The red ball could be larger than the blue ball. The common element here is that they're both balls, but there are some differences between the two. Okay, and that is the external difference. The red ball is not the same as the blue ball, even though they share this commonality, ballness, you could even say.
Okay.
Okay.
So they're different, but they're like in the same category, kind of.
Yes, and then continuing where it says in opposition, the different is not confronted by any other, but by its other. Okay, so the red and the blue ball, both of them are confronted by each other. The red ball is the different from the blue ball is the different from the red ball. Not any other. We're not talking about carrots or cars or blades of grass or whatever it is. That's any other, but by its other.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
I see.
all right. So, opposed to its contrary, each opposite has within itself its relation to its other moment. It is thus the whole self contained opposition, each contrary both containing but also excluding its opposite in affirming itself. It is thus contradiction. In positing itself, by negating the opposite through which it defines itself, it makes its being depend on the opposite it negates, and implicitly takes that opposition onto itself, becoming the negation not of another, but of itself. So, if we're talking about two persons, that's a better example. Andrew and Tim are both opposed. So you are my opposite, I am your opposite. Okay? And positing itself by negating the opposite through which it defines itself. So I am not you, you are not me. That's a negation. It makes its being depend on the opposite it negates. So my identity, we'll use this term, is dependent upon me saying I'm not you, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Then implicitly takes that opposition onto itself, becoming the negation not of another, but of itself. So my identity is not Tim, my identity becomes I am not Andrew.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Trust me, you don't need to smoke a joint to get this straight.
Yeah.
You just gotta, all right, the enemy of my enemy, A is B. Okay. Just gotta go through it carefully, read it, think about it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, continuing. Or as Hegel puts it in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the object is in one and the same respect the opposite of itself, and it is for another so far as it is for itself. Contradiction is thus difference internalized. Essential difference, which is self-relating, is also self-identical. That is, identity, the opposite of difference. Let me read that again. Contradiction is thus difference internalized. Essential difference, which is self-relating, is also self-identical. That is, identity, the opposite of difference. When this contradiction is posited and becomes explicit or for itself, the inherently self-contradictory becomes the contradiction resolved. Difference returning into itself from otherness, a unity of contradictory moments, sustained by the infinite movement of negation underlying all finite determinations.
Okay.
Okay. Key term there was identity.
Yeah. So identity is basically the opposite of difference. You said there, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So next paragraph, Bao says, it is easy to see the basis for Deleuze's criticism that Hegel's account of difference subordinates difference not just to negation, but to the identity of identity and difference. Reduced to the negative, difference is already placed on a path laid out by identity, already destined to the development of opposition into contradiction and the resolution of contradiction. Okay, I read that again. Difference is already placed on a path laid out by identity, already destined to the development of opposition into contradiction and the resolution of contradiction. In two 1956 articles, Deleuze's first countermove to Hegel relies on Berson's duration as an internal difference which does not go and does not have to go as far as contradiction, alterity, and negativity. Difference is neither the purely external difference of one thing from another, diversity, nor the difference of a thing from everything it is not, nor the differences of species sharing a common element. Rather, being is difference as duration, heterogeneity, what differs from itself and in itself. Okay.
Okay.
So we'll get to Bergson later in the book. There's a separate essay on that.
Okay.
But duration is kind of self-explanatory. So when something exists, it exists for a duration.
Right.
It has a starting point, it has an ending point. Is it clear-cut? Could be, might not be, particularly if something is coming to be, passing away, whatever. It could be a long duration, it could be a very short duration. Okay. Being is difference as duration. Heterogeneity, not homogeneity, what differs from itself and in itself. Okay, so continuing. Time is neither an undifferentiated whole, nor a series of moments external to each other, but a single self-differentiating process, an internal succession that is both heterogeneous and continuous. Okay, this is the explanation of duration here. So instead of talking about time as, time neither has a beginning nor an end, an undifferentiated whole, and a series of moments, here's now, here's now, here's now, here's now, here's now. Each of the moments were separate. Now, when you stop and think about that, if we're talking about, okay, now, this is a series of moments.
Mm-hmm.
But really, was there that much of a change between the now and the now? Sure, there was, but you probably didn't perceive that. Okay, as I said now, I shifted my left hand. If I said this now, I shifted my right hand. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but it was not the universe is created again in the now. Now it's created again. Now it's created again, like reshuffling the deck. Okay, moments external to each other. A single self-differentiating process, an internal succession that is both heterogeneous, separate points, they're not identical, not homogeneous, and continuous, one after the other. Not abstract otherness, difference outside of itself, but differential relations in duration or virtuality, and alteration as a process of differentiation through developmental tendencies that differ in nature, resulting in real differences in actual things. In virtue of its duration and the tendencies it incarnates, then, the thing differs from itself first, immediately, and not as in Hegel. The thing differs from itself because it first differs from everything it is not.
Okay.
Okay?
So the each moment is its own separate moment, and each thing is its own separate thing, but
Mhm.
they're all still part of becoming.
Yes, although Bao doesn't explicitly use becoming here. Again, the thing
Okay.
here, the thing differs from itself first, immediately. And not as in Hegel, the thing differs from itself because it first differs from everything it is not.
Right.
Okay? So, Deleuze is operating against Hegel. Remember Hegel with the determinate negation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, it differs from itself because if we're talking about the blue and the red ball. So the red ball is not distinguished from the blue ball. That's the Hegelian way. Rather, the red ball is different from itself. Okay. It is a ball, but is it the same kind of ball? This is where it kind of gets confusing. You got to sit with it a little bit. How, going back to the example of Andrew. Andrew, when he was 10 years old versus Andrew versus he was 30 years old. Differing from yourself, not from me, not from anybody else, or from
Right.
an inanimate object.
Right.
That's from yourself first and immediately,
Yeah.
not everything that is not. Okay?
Yeah. Like to go back to the idea of how like everything and everyone are always changing. Like you were
Yes.
saying, like the 10-year-old me is different from the 30-year-old me.
Yes. And through the process of becoming, you moved from your 10-year-old self to your 30-something-year-old self.
Right.
So Bao continues, next paragraph. Contradiction and opposition are illusions based on a comparison of two actualized, completed things that result from the differential actualization of the virtual in divergent tendencies.
Right.
We will see in one the negative of the other, because difference has been replaced by sterile opposition between the completed results considered, without respect to the processes that generated them. Difference is taken to be negative only insofar as it involves the diversity of actual things, the products of difference, rather than difference itself understood as duration, differentiation into tendencies, and the actualization of those tendencies.
Okay.
Okay? Difference is taken to be negative only insofar as it involves the diversity of actual things.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right? Next paragraph. Bao says, diversity is given, but difference is that by which the given is given as diverse. That is, as the actual products of differential processes, which precede all constituted differences.
Okay.
Okay? Limitation and opposition arise only within what has been actualized as effects separated from the principle and real movement of their production. In the extended, insofar as the increase in one extension necessitates a decrease in another. And in qualities, insofar as the contrariety of qualities, hot and cold, light and dark, etc., arises only with respect to already constituted qualities. Both extension and qualities mask and cancel out the differential processes that give rise to them so as to prevent negative relations of opposition.
I'm a little confused by that last part.
Okay, let me continue. Contradiction is the difference between two completed actualities, which can oppose each other only through a generic common ground, extension, quality, etc., that relates them to each other, and through which each contrary internalizes its opposite. So let's look at the balls again. Red ball, blue ball. Okay. Two completed actualities, two separate balls, oppose each other only through a generic common ground. So extension, they occupy a certain certain period of space. Quality, one is red, one is blue, and so on. Okay, a generic common ground. Relates them to each other. They're both balls. They both have a color. They might be both new. One is old, one is not new. And through each contrary internalizes its opposite. Remember, going back to the earlier point, the red is defined against the blue is defined against the red.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Difference is a function of the identity of contraries, which necessarily leads contradiction back to identity. Okay. Red is not blue. Blue is not red, because red has its own identity, blue has its own identity.
Right.
Okay, makes sense so far?
Yeah.
Bauck continues, this is equivalent to setting one point of view or opinion against another, without regard to the problem, quote, problem, for which the opinions are proposed as answers. Now think about that for a minute. This is equivalent to setting one point of view or opinion against another, without regard to the problem for which the opinions are proposed as answers. I say Trump is an asshole. You say he's not. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I take mine as the gospel truth. You might take yours as the gospel truth, and you're contradicting me. You're saying no. But what's the problem which these opinions are proposed to solve? We haven't even discussed that. You know?
Oh, okay. It's not whether Trump is an asshole.
May or may not be. Okay. If you have a problem with the way Trump is conducting his duties, calling him an asshole doesn't even get to the root of the problem. I don't like him. I don't like him. He's an asshole.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Bao continues, when it sees a confrontation between opposing contrary or contradictory propositions, the dialectic forgets the genesis of divergent tendencies from ontological difference and confuses philosophical knowledge with the interplay of rival opinions. Opposition and negation are then only illusory epiphenomena of difference.
Okay.
Okay. Continuing. Deleuze finds the same confusions in Hegel's famous dialectic of being and nothingness, according to which pure and simple being is being without any determinations or differentiation, or being in an unqualified sense, which is, with respect to its absence of determinations and qualities, the same as nothingness, such that being and nothingness pass over into one another and develop into becoming. Okay, we saw this in the Stanford article. So whenever one thinks of something, being is already there. Being is not a quality. Being is not a characteristic. It is just something that's there. Okay?
I don't understand that.
Okay. Remember what we were saying about a unicorn.
Oh, okay.
So you think of a unicorn. It could be a big unicorn, small unicorn, red, blue, whatever it is. Okay, these are all determinations and differentiation. Differentiation being, if you think of a red unicorn versus a blue unicorn. We're going to shift gears with the ball example here. Regardless, being is always there. And then we think back to something else I had mentioned too about Kant. Kant had said, being is not a predicate. Being is just there.
Okay.
Okay. You can't say that, I mean, when you say that this unicorn I'm thinking of exists, okay, exists is a verb. Being is already there.
So
But
is it like that seems to me that it would then either mean that being is just as fictional as a unicorn or that a unicorn is just as real as being? I think it's probably the latter, right?
well, I wouldn't say that being is a fiction.
Right,
Okay. Let's shift gears a minute and go a little bit later on to Heidegger. Okay, being with a capital B.
right.
Okay, being with a capital B is not a concept. Being with a capital B is not a notion. It's something we can think about, but can we think about being capital B apart from something?
No.
That's the first question. Okay, so can we think about something without it existing or there being or it being?
Yes.
That's the point.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. So what Hegel was getting at, in the science of logic with about being is the pure and simple being without any determinations or differentiation in an unqualified sense. Okay. But the problem is it is the same as nothingness unless you introduce becoming.
Right.
Being and nothingness pass over into one another and develop into becoming. Okay. So Bao continues. Following Bergson, Deleuze considers the dialectic of being and nothingness to be a false movement among ill-defined terms. Indeterminate and general being is a generality opposed to nothingness, which is itself a mere pseudo-idea. And both are solutions to the false problem of why is there something rather than nothing, rather than the genuine problem of why this rather than something else, why this tension of duration, why this speed rather than another. So, what he's getting at here, instead of thinking of being and nothingness as two separate things, they're bleeding over into one another. Okay,
Oh,
this is
okay.
this is this is becoming. So,
Right.
it's a mistake to think about being and nothingness as something separate. This is where we fall into a trap. So, what's one way to look about it? So if we go back to the water example, remember water going into vapor and then ice. So if you're looking at water in its liquid state, instead of saying this is water, being or nothingness, is it water or is it not water? Okay. Why water rather than Diet Coke? Okay. These are the questions that Deleuze is proposing to ask instead. Why water rather than Diet Coke? Why this tension of duration, meaning it's existing in a duration. So why is it liquid rather than gas or ice? Why this speed rather than another? So if you're boiling the water and it's already starting to bubble and turning into gas, why this speed rather than it just at rest? So
Mm-hmm.
then Deleuze is continuing. The idea of non-being appears when, instead of grasping different realities which are indefinitely substituted for one another, we muddle them together in the homogeneity of a being, capital B in general, which can then only be opposed to nothingness. So again, rather than thinking of being and nothingness as two separate things, they are bleeding into one another and then thinking in terms of duration or whatever it is. To put it simply, Deleuze is trying to get away from thinking of these in an abstraction, because when
Right.
you think in an abstraction, this is where you're going to fall into difficulty. Okay.
That's interesting because it seems like he's making them more clear by making them more abstract.
Yeah, I guess you could see that, but it's about, for lack of a better term, because it's somewhat of a loaded concept, the concept. Okay, when you're thinking about being, the concept of being, which is what I said before, and even Heidegger would say that being is not a concept. Because when you think about it, a concept, you immediately put boundaries around it. And then you're just like, well, how in the hell do we define being without reference to something?
Mm-hmm.
Does being have a quality to it? Doesn't seem to be.
It's just like how he talks about when Heidegger talks about the nothing. It's the same sort of thing. Like we can't conceptualize nothing because we think of something when we're thinking of something to with which to identify what nothing is.
Right. Or if we try to define nothing, and this is very much in relation to apophatic theology, defining what God is not rather than what God
Right.
is.
That we talked about last week.
Yeah, we'll get more
Yeah.
into that. So, in the case of apophatic theology, you're not defining what God is, you're defining what God is not, but you're still starting with God. And then as you define God, it is against something. The cataphatic, yes, the cataphatic theology would say God is divine light, for example. Apophatic says God is not divine light. But what is divine light?
Right.
First, there is something called a divine light, and what's its definition? And then you're defining God, because you already believe in God, taking it as a given, defining it against something that is already sort of a given. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So don't think of being and nothingness as something separate. Rather not why is there something rather than nothing, but why this rather than something else? One question. Why this tension of duration? Why this speed rather than another? And so on.
Right.
So don't muddle them together. And then continuing, the dialectic is thus a false movement of abstract and unreal contraries, which pass back and forth through imprecision, establishing fictitious oppositions in order to resolve them in an entirely fictitious manner.
Okay.
Okay? We good
Mm-hmm.
so far?
Yeah.
You utterly confused yet?
I think I'm clear on that part for now. Yeah.
All right. So moving into the next section, same page. The critique of negation. All right. So Bao says, negation is not added to what it negates. This is him quoting Deleuze, but only points to a weakness in who it is that negates. Let me read that again. Negation is not added to what it negates, but only points to a weakness in who it is that negates. The question is then, who negates, or for whom is negation primary?
Okay.
He continues, it is only from the point of view of reactive forces and ressentiment that differential and genealogical forces become opposition, negation, and contradiction. For the slave, the person of ressentiment, in whom reactions dominate actions, begins with the negative, needs to conceive a non-ego, then to oppose himself to this non-ego in order to finally posit himself as self. So he's referring here to the master-slave dialectic and the phenomenology of spirit.
Okay.
The master exerts power over the slave. However, the master does not exist without the slave, and the slave does not exist without the master.
Okay.
So the slave, this is kind of a simplistic way of describing it. The slave exerts some power over the master because, again, the master does not become the master unless he has a slave.
Right.
Okay? Needs to conceive a non-ego, then to oppose himself to this non-ego in order to finally posit himself as self. So the master is not the slave. The master, as the master, can only posit himself as the master in opposition to the slave.
Right.
Okay. This is pseudo-affirmation through the negation of the negation, rather than the genuine affirmation of difference. Rather than being logical operations, affirmation and negation are first qualities of becoming active, affirmation, or becoming reactive, negation, expressed in affirmative or negative evaluations of life. And the slave or reactive person is one who experiences the suffering of life as negative and in need of redemption because he is unable to make use of that suffering and affirm it, and so instead condemns and accuses life in the name of so-called higher values, values transcendent to life. So here is Deleuze's Nietzschean reading of Hegel.
Okay.
Okay. Concept of ressentiment is a French term, very important in Nietzsche, which is the naysaying against life.
Right.
Okay, a reactive force. So, to summarize this, instead of using the master-slave, instead of the master and the slave being in opposition with one another, and the both of them, their identities rest upon negating the other, the slave is not the master is not the slave.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So affirmation, negation, qualities becoming. So then the slave or reactive person, if I'm the slave, I suffer through life, I have a negative perception of it. I'm in need of redemption because I cannot do anything with this suffering and affirm it. So then I condemn and accuse life in the name of so-called higher values, values, transcendence of life. And then this is where religion would come in. So continuing with the Nietzschean reading, I, as the person who's suffering, I got the shit out of the stick in life. I don't accept my faith and try to do something positive with that sense of suffering. Instead, I say, at some point in the future, in the afterlife, the meek shall inherit the earth, blah, 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 type of thing.
Okay.
Okay? Makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's the Nietzschean reading.
Okay.
So Bao continues. Hegel's dialectic distorts negation and affirmation by making them into symmetrical logical operations. Negation is opposed to affirmation, but affirmation differs from negation. Let me read that again. Negation is opposed to affirmation, but affirmation differs from negation. As the affirmative will, the master, does not negate the slave, but affirms and enjoys as different from the slave in affirming himself. I am the master, I am superior to the slave. Whereas the slave must negate the master to achieve the pseudo-affirmation of the negation of the negation. I, the slave, am not the master, but I am affirming myself as not the master.
Okay. So they're like the slave and the master are different from each other, but it's not that the slave is not the master and the master is not the slave. It's that they're sort of essential to one another in order to be defined in those ways.
That's the Hegelian approach. So that's where the
Okay.
negation comes in, where they're in opposition.
Okay.
So instead, what's going on is one is high, one is low. Okay. If you, of the two, you want to be the master and not the slave.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's kind of a no-brainer. But the affirmative will, the master, does not negate the slave. No, I as the master am not the slave, and thank God I'm not, but affirms and enjoys his difference from the slave and affirming himself. Okay, so I am different. I am not opposed. I am not. Okay, listen to the language here. I as the master am not the slave. I as the master am different from the slave. Notice the
Mm-hmm.
difference there?
Yeah.
Okay. The one, the not, kind of holds the slave at a distance. But the difference is, okay, so I as the master depend on the slave, but I affirm myself as not being the slave, more or less in a
Right.
privileged position.
Right.
Whereas the slave has to negate to overcome his status. So it's sort of,
I
so
see.
with the difference for the master of the slave, this is a one-way street.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
got it?
Because the master is seen as superior to the slave.
Right.
Right. Okay.
So the slave is the one that has the ressentiment, again, the Nietzschean reading, that negates the master. I am not the master, so I am affirming myself as negating the negation.
Right. Okay.
All right. So then continuing to the next section, the master-slave dialectic. For Hegel, the nature of human desire is that it desires to enjoy its own independent consciousness or subjectivity. But since consciousness is an entirely fluid process of negating its object, it cannot find any stability in itself or objectify itself on its own. Consequently, consciousness seeks itself in the form of another consciousness. This is the unhappy consciousness he's talking about, by the way, and desires the other consciousness as subjectivity, that is, as desire. What consciousness desires is the desire of the other, through which the other recognizes it as consciousness.
Okay.
Okay, so let me try to break this down. Let's look at Tim and Andrew. Okay, so Tim, consciousness. I want my own independent consciousness or subjectivity. I am I. Tim is Tim. But it's not fixed. I'm not fixed. I'm in the process of negating its object. I can't find any stability in myself because I'm changing all the time, and I can't objectify myself on my own because I am a subject. What am I going to objectify myself against? So what I'm doing is I'm seeking something out, somebody else out. I see Andrew. Okay, so what I want from Andrew is Andrew to recognize me as a separate consciousness. Make sense?
I lost my connection for like 30 seconds there.
Okay, let me say that again. So this is in the phenomenology of spirit called the unhappy consciousness. Okay, so the consciousness. Let's go back to Tim and Andrew. So me, Tim, as consciousness. I want my own independent consciousness or subjectivity. Can't accomplish this is because it's fluid. I'm an unstable entity, and I can't objectify myself. So what I seek out, and I find Andrew, what I wish is for Andrew to recognize me, Tim, as a separate consciousness.
Okay.
Okay. That's what is going on here.
Okay.
Since it wants to enjoy or possess itself, consciousness seeks to compel the other to recognize it. The other, which wants the same thing, engages in the same movement, and there ensues a struggle for recognition. So what I'm doing with you, you in turn are doing with me.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, continuing. The victor of this struggle is the master, who is prepared to sacrifice his life in order to gain recognition of his freedom. The loser is the slave, who is more attached to life than to freedom. However, in the long run, it is the slave who triumphs through work. By transforming nature, the slave elevates himself above nature and life and creates culture. Only when both self and other have risen above natural needs can there be a mutual recognition of two subjectivities who freely recognize each other, rather than being compelled to do so by attachment to life and the fear of death. Though through the free mutual recognition mediated through human cultural institutions, morality, law, custom, each is for itself what it is for the other, and thus returns into itself from out of the other and realizes the truth implicit in the self-other relationship, spirit. I that is we, and we that is I.
The
Okay.
the only part I'm confused by there is the idea of the spirit.
Okay. The absolute spirit. Okay,
Yeah.
remember what we were doing at the top of the episode when we were talking about the absolute spirit marching through history?
Yes.
Okay. So the absolute spirit, remember, this is an absolute idealism we're talking about.
Right.
So instead of this struggle for recognition, this master-slave dialectic, with culture, with society, and then to the one extreme is about the state, then we become separate entities mutual recognition without a struggle over one another.
Okay.
So the I is part of the we, we'll say is part of the state. And the state is in me. I am in the state is in me, to use an example.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that's overcoming the master-slave dialectic. All right.
Okay.
But Bao continues. Deleuze regards this whole dialectic as involving only slaves. Beneath the Hegelian image of the master, the slave always peeks out. For the Hegelian master's desire for recognition makes him a slave from the outset. Only a slave regards power as something one is granted or recognized in accordance with established values, rather than an affirmative capability which creates new values. From the standpoint of a genuine master, power as creative will has no need of being recognized in order to have value. So again, here's that Nietzschean reading. So what he's saying here is that with the Hegelian master, there's already some kind of ressentiment going on because the master is trying to take power in accordance with established values rather than creating new values. Well, we won't say transcending, but whatever exists of the established values, one creates new values instead of trying to attain power within those established values.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So a genuine master, and this is kind of where the Übermensch comes in, a genuine master, power as creative will, has no need of being recognized in order to have value. Why? Because the Übermensch is a new being that is over the overman.
Okay.
Okay. Again, this is the Nietzschean reading of Hegel here. All
Okay.
right.
So
Going.
is that some of how Hegel influenced existentialism?
Not quite.
Okay.
Well, let's see. With the master slave, I don't recall. But definitely when you're coming to the in itself and the for itself, let's go ahead and fast forward to Sartre here for a minute. So, in Sartre's phenomenology, there is the in itself, which is exemplified in an inanimate object, and the for itself, which has consciousness. Okay.
Right.
The for itself is trying to become an in itself through bad faith. When the waiter go about his daily business, you ask him, how do you define yourself? He defines himself as a waiter in the things he does day by day. He's exercising bad faith. Why? Because he's trying to become an in itself and a robot,
Okay.
devoid of any kind of responsibility for what he does, the choices he makes during the day, the choices that he remains as being a waiter versus something else, and so on. Okay.
Okay.
Shades of Hegel here. It's not a one-to-one correspondence.
Okay.
Okay. So continuing. All right. Going to the next page. Deleuze sees rational autonomy as the establishment of a new servitude to reason itself, the subjection of the living being to the rational being. Okay. Kant was the enemy, remember.
Right.
Reason persuades us that in submitting to reason, we move from being merely natural beings of instinct and inclination to reasonable beings. But this is the subjection of life and the living being to values and laws beyond life, which negate and devalue life. Again, Nietzschean reading. We are still subjugated then. We are still asked to obey, to submit, to take on burdens, to recognize only reactive forms of life and accusatory forms of thought, to internalize the laws and established values which command us. Okay, continuing. Only a genuinely affirmative will can create, and creation requires a critique of current values and the destruction of reactive forces both within and outside oneself.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
Questions so far?
No, I understand that.
Okay. And let's see. How much more can we go here? All right. Mm. All right, so we'll go ahead and skip to we'll skip to page 139, sense certainty. I'll just
Okay.
kind of breeze through it because I'm starting to get a little tired. All right. So Bao continues. As Deleuze specifies, pluralism is identical with empiricism. We've seen this before. And empiricism is concerned with the concrete richness of the sensible. Hegel's critique of pluralism is thus a critique of knowledge as this is obtained through the sensory apprehension of an empirical given in the here and now. In the sense certainty chapter of the Phenomenology, Hegel says that sensory experience wants to grasp the actuality of the object through pure receptivity to an empirical object, independently of any contribution from the subject, such as the categories of the understanding. It wants to grasp the object in its immediacy, as pure being, without any determinations or predicates. But in doing so, consciousness can only point to its object, this, here, now. However, every this is as much a this as any other. And at each this is also not another thises, in the same way that the other thises are neither it nor any other this. With respect to its utter indeterminacy and lack of content, pure being, as grasped through pure sensory receptivity, is equivalent to nothing, just as in the science of logic, pure being passes over into nothingness. Okay, so unpacking this. In the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel says that sensory experience wants to be pure. Whatever the empirical object is, such as, the apple on my table, my sense experience wants to grasp it in its totality. We're kind of seeing also shades of 20th century phenomenology here. The pure experience of that object within consciousness. We're not describing it as an apple. We're not saying it's red. We're not saying it's of a certain size or whatever it is. Just immediacy, pure being.
Right.
But it can only point to its object, this object here, this object now. But this is equivalent to nothing, so Deleuze says. When consciousness tries to grasp hold of the truth of what it apprehends through sensation by expressing it in language, it undergoes the same dialectical reversal. The words now, here, this do not designate any particular now, here, or this, but any now, here, or this in general. That is, they designate the universal rather than the particular that was meant. It is just not possible for us to express in words a sensuous being that we mean. The truth of sense certainty is perception, which grasps the sensuous being through the mediation of universals. Time and space as the forms of intuition, the categories of the understanding, and the unity of the I as a synthesis of faculties and synthesis over time.
So, how I don't understand how that's nothing, then. How that's related to nothing.
I think it's because it's inescapable that when you perceive something, an object,
Yeah.
you're perceiving it through some category.
Okay.
Okay. Now, let me shift gears a minute and go to latter-day phenomenology. So when we get to Husserl, and there's an essay in the book on Husserl. So Husserl's method was perception, experience. The object that you experience before you bracket. The term he used was called the epoche, which is a bracketing. Bracketing means you're putting aside any preconceptions that you have about the object, such as, is it an apple? Is it red? Is it of a certain size or whatever it is? And you are trying to experience the object absent of any other categories or any other descriptions.
To put it into its own specific category.
No, you're not even putting it into a category.
Oh, okay.
This is an immediate experience of an object.
Oh, okay. So you
Okay.
don't know what it is yet.
Right, you don't know what it is yet. Now,
Okay.
as soon as you use a term to describe it and you say apple, you've already put it into a category. Because you've already identified that object. Okay? Make sense?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I still had myself muted.
Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So, continuing, next paragraph. Bao says, Deleuze objects that in this movement, the singular here, now, this is indeed not captured in the abstract universals of the dialectic, but is stripped of all its concrete richness and determinations. The sensible is rather the stubbornness of the existent in intuition which resists any specification of the concept. There is, says Deleuze, a being of the sensible, which is not a particular sensible being, and is not the given, but that by which the given is given. Something that can only be sensed is what forces sensation. Okay. So it's like, so in the sensible, it is a brute experience. Here it is. Here, now, this. And remember, Deleuze is about empiricism. Okay, we'd seen that in the previous essays.
Right.
So the dialectic is not even operating here, at least according to Hegel. Okay, this is a brute experience that one has, sensibility.
Okay.
And then he continues, Bao says, quoting Deleuze, what is a sensation? It is the operation of contracting trillions of vibrations onto a receptive surface, and is manifested in consciousness as the sensing of a quality in a spatially located and spatially extended object. Sensation is a product of forces acting from without on the sensibility of the subject, or on a capacity to be affected as it is itself a degree of power.
How is that a degree of power?
To be affected, that is itself a degree of power. Okay, so let me continue. These interacting forces are the sufficient reason for what is sensed, both for that it is sensed and how it is sensed. It is these forces which give each sensation and each sensible thing a singularity, seen as before, which escapes the concept. Difference of potential, difference of intensity is the reason for qualitative diversity. Form the objects of investigation for a, quote, superior empiricism, a, quote, transcendental empiricism. Aha, we've seen this term
Okay.
before.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does he mean by transcendental empiricism? Concepts are not involved.
Okay.
Okay. However, we're talking about difference of potential, intensity, qualitative diversity. Okay. So transcendental, again, in this case, is a la Kant, something that exists not in an otherworldly realm, but something that is kind of immanent but above the flux. Okay.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Yeah.
So empirically, you're experiencing something. No, let's bring Kant back into this again. Kant defines it as one experiences something and has an intuition. That's the term he used. Within the mind. And then a concept is deployed to categorize whatever that intuition is. Deleuze is doing away with that. No concept.
Okay.
If we're talking about difference and not identity, if we're talking about potential, intensity, how strong is it, how weak it is, qualitative diversity here, then we can use that to escape the concepts. Because When you're deploying a concept onto that, you've now categorized it, put it into a box, and applied a label to it.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, Bao continues. Intensities exist as singular points in a system of differential relations, or virtual systems, a system of liaisons or differential relations among particles and of singularities corresponding to the degrees of variation to these relations.
Okay.
Okay? Each intensity is also internally differentiated in the form of a differential series of variable ratios. Every intensity is by its nature unequal to itself, or heterogeneous in itself, in the matter of Berson's duration. In
Right.
that way, since intensity is already difference, it refers to a series of other differences which affirms by affirming itself, and returns to itself not as an I recognized by another, but as a differentiated difference within the field of differences, as difference with self prior to the difference between one and the other. That's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So continuing on. As well as grounding qualitative sensible difference, intensity functions as an individuating factor in both subject and object. The individuation characteristic of things is an intrinsic determination, an intensive quantity, or difference of intensity. Individuation, by which something becomes an individual, is the product of divergent processes of actualization or differentiation of a multiplicity or manifold of intensities. Multiplicity being an organization pertaining to the many as such, in which elements are other without being several, inasmuch as their being is determined only through their relation to each other. A multiplicity is not actual, but is a fully real system of differential elements and relations, a structure, linguistic, genetic, physical, etc., that is completely determined prior to the actualization that expresses it. Okay. So mentioned here is the notion of the virtual, which we've seen before.
And individuation.
Correct. So actual versus virtual. Okay. So I had mentioned this earlier, is that you can talk about an actual thing and a virtual thing. Both of them are real. One actually exists in physical reality, the virtual does not. I mean, using the computer metaphor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Virtual reality. It's still a reality, but it is not actualized.
Right.
Okay. And so, as Bao says, individuation is the product of divergent processes of actualization or differentiation of a multiplicity, which is a virtual notion, or manifold of intensities. Okay. Multiplicity is not actual, but a fully real system of differential elements and relations. They're not actual.
So
And
was he saying in the last part of that all of these factors are predetermined?
no, I would not say I wouldn't say that they're predetermined.
Okay.
Rather that they are fully real. Again, the term to keep
Oh,
in mind
okay.
here is virtual.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So to put all this in a nutshell, individuation is not something that just emerges willy-nilly. Poof, there it is. And
Mm-hmm.
it is self-contained. Okay. Remember with Deleuze, it's always about difference, not about
Mm-hmm.
identity. Identity emerges from difference. And then intensities that exist within perception or experience, the transcendental empiricism, um, the manifold of intensities. Okay, so I'm starting to get a little sleepy here. So the upshot of this is they are there, but they are there virtually. The intensities, the multiplicity, manifold of intensities, and so on.
Okay.
Okay, so and then the last paragraph, the conditions of real experience. Quote, the conditions of real experience are indistinguishable from intensity as such. And transcendental or superior empiricism is precisely the search for conditions of real experience that are no broader or more general than the conditioned, not the empty universals of now, here, this, which Hegel ridiculed, but now here complexes of space-time generated by the dynamic interplay of intensities, and which can only be sensed and encountered rather than known or recognized. Okay, so to put this another way, if we want to find out what the conditions of real experience are, you don't even go to concepts. You don't even go to universals. These are the transcendental grounds of what happens when one has an experience. Rather, experience is what one experiences. You
Oh, that's
sense it and you
interesting.
encounter it. You
Yeah,
don't
that
know
makes
it or
sense.
recognize. Okay, when you're talking about an experience, I'm having an experience right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I kind of know that I'm having an experience, but then when I articulate it, I'm already starting to use universals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and describing it.
And
And the best way that I can think about this is Zen meditation. Okay, when you sit in the lotus position and you're quieting your mind and you're focusing on the breathing, that you are open to experience. You're open to intensities. Thought
mm-hmm.
comes in, push it away. Change in the temperature. Okay, you're already experiencing it, and you're not even using. I mean, you're aware that it is there, but when you're saying I'm cold, then you're starting to use language to describe it. This
Yeah.
is this is a difficult way to explain it because I'm using language.
Well, and like all of the words that we use to describe our experiences and all of the concepts that we identify are already preformed in our heads. So we attach these labels to what we define as reality and a real experience, and then we define it that way.
Yes, and then now here are complexes of space-time generated by the dynamic interplay of intensities. So it's almost like a field, you could say, the field of
Ah,
experience. These experiences, some intensities are stronger than others, and so they engender this experience or this event. You could even say this multiplicity. Others are weaker and then they subside. They come into being, they pass away, they change, they come back again, they pass away again, they might come back again, and so on and so forth. So all of this is what Deleuze is trying to say is describing the conditions of real experience.
right.
Still on mute again.
No, I lost your audio for about 10 seconds there.
Okay. Well, there wasn't much to say than what I had already said.
Okay.
Okay, so that is it for Deleuze and Hegel. And so the upshot of the essay is that, again, we see difference, we see multiplicity, we see transcendental empiricism. We've seen this before. Working against the dialectic, you know, Deleuze really doesn't have any use for the dialectic, and negation.
Right.
We're against negation. Negation isn't even a notion or concept we should bother ourselves with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is in opposition to Hegel's perception of that.
Well, negation is in opposition to being.
Yeah.
Being is in opposition to negation. So no oppositions here. Differences.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so yes, again, that is it for the Hegel essay.
Awesome. That's interesting. That was as always really helpful to guide through that to sort of understand what these ideas are all about much better. But
Yes, I don't think I
but
did a complete hatchet job with Hegel in the beginning.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
All
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, thanks to everyone for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Thanks to all of you who subscribe to my channel, press like on this video and share it, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. Really appreciate that, and I'll add the link in the description for this video, like I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right. Keep having mindgasms until next time, everyone. And oh, so what's the next delusional part that we're doing? What's the next
Marx.
one? Marx. Oh, that's a good segue to go to from Hegel.
Yeah, because I think just breezing through that, we're going to be focusing more with the Marx essay. We're going to be focusing a little more on something less abstract, but we're also going to be focused. We're going also going to be looking at Guattari, Felix Guattari.
Right, who co-wrote a lot of books with Deleuze, right?
Yes, and so A Thousand Plateaus is mentioned in there.
Okay. All right. All right. So yeah, thanks so much again for talking. This is always fun. And any last words?
Yes, be neither a master nor a slave.
Yes, good idea. All right. Uh, Adios until next time, everyone. Have a good night, and see you, Tim.
Yep.
All right.